All right, some more dividend theory. So, two effects that we definitely think play a part in dividend policy. First one being what's called the clientele effect. And basically, it is partially a tax argument, partially not a tax argument. It's a tax argument in the sense in that they identify the fact that there are different types of investors. Some investors are going to be in much higher tax brackets to where they really don't want that dividend because they're going to have to pay a tax on it. And then there are clientele. There's some investors that are maybe in low tax brackets. And so dividends aren't as painful for them to receive as capital gains as they would be for a high tax individual. Or they may want the actual income that's provided by a cash dividend. So it's like you got these two groups of people basically. We'll call them like the high tax over here and the low tax over here. Right? So high tax are going to want low dividends, high capital gains. Whereas the low tax people want high dividends and they don't feel the need for the low capital gain. And we can also add in that these people want income, those low tax people, they want that cash income, whereas these high tax people don't have the need for income. So we'll scratch it out there. And it basically says to design a dividend policy that is going to target one of these groups, right? Because you can't do both. You know, it's either like you're going to appeal to the high tax, no income people, or you're going to appeal to the low tax, high income people. And the idea also is that neither group is better than the other. You know, it's not preferential. No studies have found that it's preferential to target, you know, the high tax people versus the low tax people. But what we do know is don't make them switch, right? Because it could be like a company could be like, well, look, we used to pay out no dividends, but now we used to pay dividends. And so, yeah, our clientele is going to change. No big deal to us. Yeah, your clientele isn't going to be oh so happy about that because they can't just switch to the opposite type of company. Right? Like if you decide to change from a high tax to a low tax and they wanted a high tax, they can't just immediately jump back into a high tax company. Why? Brokerage costs. Right? Again, we have to go back to like the real world and realize the fact that we have brokerage costs whenever we buy and sell stock, that if I sell my stock and I realize a capital gain on it, I'm going to get taxed. Right? That's going to piss me off as the investor. That just because you decided all of a sudden you wanted to have a different dividend policy, now I have to incur all these costs so I can switch back to my preferred type of distribution. And then you run the risk that what if you can't attract some of the other clientele to come to your firm? Maybe they just don't trust that you'll stick with the policy, in the long run. And so clientele effect basically says pick a clientele and target it and stick with it. Don't change the type of distributions you do, right? That you're going to either be a company that typically pays out a high amount of dividends, and that again is going to be attractive to those investors that are in those low tax brackets or that want cash income, or you're going to be a company that pays out low or no dividends to where you're going to be attractive to individuals that are in that high tax bracket that don't need that income. Now, who are we talking about here? A lot of times we group it into old people and young people as one way, right? That young people, typically, you may or may not be married yet, so you may or may not have that tax benefit, right, of being able to file jointly. You may or may not have kids yet, so you may or may not have that tax deduction that helps you out. You're typically in your higher earning stages, right? Maybe not right when you get out of college, but let's say mid-30s, mid-40s. You don't need that income every quarter because you have a paycheck, right? And you're like, look, please, no, don't give me the dividend. I already pay enough in taxes, right? I'm just going to end up paying my high tax rate on those dividends that I don't even need to be receiving. Like, if I was going to invest in a stock, I would not invest in a dividend paying stock. We're not currently technically dinks because my husband's currently going back to school and not working right now. He was working when he was doing his like early college work, but with a respiratory therapy program, they have to do some clinical hours. That, yeah, that's, we're not living like teenagers again. No, thank you. But you know, if we were in our normal state of being dinks, dual income, no kids, we pay a pretty decent tax rate on our money, right? It's like that sucky place, the in-between place where you're not, this is going to sound terrible, I know. I realize I'm checking my privilege right now. You're not poor enough to get all of the benefits from government help, government assistance, lower tax rates. We don't have kids, so we don't get that tax break. But we don't make enough money to like hire a tax accountant and try to like avoid some taxes, right? Not evade. Evasion is illegal. Avoidance is legal. So it's kind of like that weird in between where you're stuck just paying a high marginal tax rate on your income. We don't want the dividend. I would never take a dividend paying stock. Like, please, I'm just going to pay more taxes. Whereas who falls into the other group? Old people. Old, retired people. Why? Okay, well, they're retired. So they may be receiving Social Security or a pension or retirement payouts. But it's not the same as a monthly paycheck, right? It's probably reduced earnings. They want that regular income coming in, so they're in a lower tax bracket. They appreciate the cash income coming in since they're retired. And there's a little box when you fill out your taxes. It asks if you are, I don't know if it's blind or deaf, or if it's just blind, or if it's just deaf. Some kind of question about that. And then they also ask if you were born before a certain year, and they ask it for you and your spouse. Why do they ask if you're born before a certain year? Because old people pay lower taxes automatically because they're old. Right? Every year that year changes, and eventually you'll be able to, hopefully you'll live that long to check that box. And if the rule still applies at that time, you'll be able to pay a lower tax rate just because you're old. Fun, huh? So, other groups that would fall into that low tax, high income type of clientele, things like pension funds, endowment funds. These are typically all in lower tax brackets and pay lower taxes. And so they wouldn't mind receiving that dividend. And so, like I said, the theory basically says, pick a clientele, stick with it. Don't change it because it's expensive for your clientele to switch. And neither clientele is better than the other. Exact wording here for your official definitions. It says the attraction of companies with specific dividend policies to those investors whose needs are best served by those policies. What I just said, companies with high dividends will have a clientele of investors with low marginal tax rates and strong desires for income. Companies with low dividends will have just the opposite, a clientele of investors with high marginal tax rates and little need for current income. Neither is better. Just pick one and stick with it. But start noticing that stability becomes a thing, right? Like, don't be switching between capital gains and dividends every year. Pick one and stick with it. Now, that is one of the things that's going to lead to this concept of dividend stability. That what investors do not like is instability and uncertainty when it comes to distribution policies. And one of the reasons is because of clientele effect, right? That they don't want to be attracted to the company because you pay dividends and then you switch on them. They don't want to be attracted to the company because you pay capital gains mostly and then you switch on them. Right? So don't flip-flop between the two. Pick one and stick with it. Now, what we'll do in the next video is signaling theory, which is going to also cause an argument for dividend stability, but not so much for the clientele effect, but for the signal that it sends to investors whenever we increase our dividend and whenever we cut our dividend. And I'm not sure how far I am on time, and so I'll just do signaling theory in the next video to make sure.